The author is now going to go on to talk about the things that are disliked, or we can say discouraged in prayer, which generally refers to those actions that if they're done, the prayer is still valid, but by performing such acts, one's reward of the prayer is decreased, or you could say that one is stealing from the reward of the prayer by performing these disliked acts. So the first thing that the author clarifies here is the places where dua in relation to prayer is considered disliked. So he says, وَأَمَّا مَكْرُهَاتِ الصَّلَاةِ, as for those things that are discouraged in prayer, فَالدُّعَاءُ بَعْدَ الْإِحْرَامِ وَقَبْلَ الْقِرَاءَةِ, making dua after a person makes their takbiratul ihram, before they start reciting Surah al-Fatiha, according to the Malikiyyah, it is considered disliked, because after the ihram, one is recommended to go directly into fulfilling the wajib, although there is a hadith that mentions specific dua after ihram, which is what the Hanafi practices. According to the Malikiyah, there was no amal bihi, meaning that it was contrary to the amal of Medina, or of the scholars of Medina. So although there was a hadith that mentions it, they did not find the people practicing it therein, and so for that reason, the Maliki scholars considered it disliked. وَالدُّعَاءُ فِي أَثْنَاءِ الْفَاتِحَةِ, making dua during the Surah al-Fatiha. For example, let's say during the time that we're reading Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, that in itself is a dua. When we say Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, Ya Allah, guide us to the straight path. So during that time when a person is reading it, maybe they want to make a dua, Oh Allah, guide me on the straight path, or Oh Allah, make me of those who are muttaqeen, the God-fearing. And so that's what he's referring to here, meaning that making a separate dua during the Fatiha that is not from the Fatiha, meaning a person making a specific dua because of something that they're listening to or that they hear recited in the Fatiha, is considered disliked. And then he says, وَأَثْنَاءِ السُّورَةِ, also during the surah. So after reading al-Fatiha, during the surah, for example, if a person hears a description of the hellfire and then makes a dua to say, Ya Allah, save me from the hellfire, this is considered disliked, because takbiratul ihram, the general gist of what we just mentioned, talking about where it is not permissible to make dua during recitation, is because during the prayer we are recommended not to speak about anything that is outside of things directly related to the prayer, like the recitation. So for this reason and other similar reasons, the Malikis considered it disliked. Then he says, وَالدُّعَاءُ فِي الرُّكُوعِ وَالدُّعَاءُ بَعْدَ التَّشَهُّدِ الْأَوَّلِ. Then he mentions that dua fi ruku' is also disliked. And so making dua in ruku' is also disliked in our school, because in ruku' the place of the thing that is supposed to be done in the ruku' is the praising of Allah. And the area of dua is when a person is in sujood. So ruku' is for praising Allah, and sujood is where we make dua. So making dua in ruku' is one of the disliked acts according to the Maliki school. وَالدُّعَاءُ بَعْدَ التَّشَهُّدِ الْأَوَّلِ, also making dua after the first sitting, which is in the second rak'ah. So after we finish the tashahhud, saying ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh, we're going to stand up, and we're not going to make a dua, because the dua and the salawat on the Prophet ﷺ is going to come in the last rak'ah. So that's what it means with du'a ba'da tashahhud al-awwali, making dua during the first tashahhud, which occurs in the second rak'ah. وَالدُّعَاءُ بَعْدَ السَّلَامِ الْإِمَامِ, and making dua after the salam of the imam. Pay attention, because what he's referring to here is an issue in regards to following the imam. When the imam is finished his prayer, for example, a person when he is following the imam, once the imam says Assalamu alaikum, then a person shouldn't continue saying a dua in his tashahhud, but he should say Assalamu alaikum right behind the imam, because we're requested to follow the imam, and following the imam is wajib, and making dua is mustahab, and thus wajib is given preference over mustahab. So when the imam says Assalamu alaikum, do not sit and continue doing your tashahhud, but just say Assalamu alaikum. وَالسُّجُودُ عَلَى الثِّيَابِ وَالْبُسُطِ وَشِبْهِهِمَا مِمَّا فِيهِ رَفَاهِيَةٌ بِخِلَافِ الْحَسِيرِ. He says, now he's going to talk about some other things that are considered disliked, and he says, وَالسُّجُودُ عَلَى الثِّيَابِ, making sujood on any type of material. For example, you see some people when they're praying, they will put down a face cloth or something on the ground because they don't want to put their forehead on the ground. This is disliked because it negates having humility in prayer. Because a person is praying towards Allah and feels that he can't get a little sand on his head, and so he puts down a little towel. That is considered disliked unless a person is doing it because the ground is very cold or very hot, and so obviously they're doing that in order to remove some harm. But to do it because one doesn't feel that it's not clean enough to put one's head on the ground when there's no impurity there, then this is considered disliked, and this is what he's referring to when he says وَالسُّجُودُ عَلَى الثِّيَابِ. And then he says وَالسُّجُودُ عَلَى الثِّيَابِ وَالْبُسُطِ, and on carpets. In reality, is considered disliked according to the Malikiyyah to pray on carpets, but what this means is the placing of a carpet for the prayer. So it doesn't mean that it's disliked nowadays or even in the past to pray in a masjid that has a carpet, but what it means is, for example, let's say in your house you have a wooden floor. To take a prayer carpet and put it on the floor to make sujood on it so that your hands or your forehead go on the mat for sujood, then this is disliked for the same reason that we mentioned before, because it negates khushu', which is humbleness and God-fearingness during the prayer. And that's why it says على الثياب والبسط وشبههما مما فيه رفاهية. And likewise any other thing that is like a carpet that possesses, that gives one lax and luxury, we can say. Rafahiyatun means something that causes one to be lax and provides luxury. For example, when praying on a soft carpet. So for example, you have a hardwood floor, and instead of praying on the hardwood floor, you lay out a mat or you lay out any type of material that's going to give you some type of comfort and luxury. So the word, you can say rafahiyatun means comfort and luxury, because these type of things remove some type of khushu', some type of humbleness away from the prayer. And so for this reason the Maliki is considered disliked. But then he says بِخِلَافِ الْحَسِيرِ فَإِنَّهُ لَا يُكْرَهُ السُّجُودُ عَلَيْهَا وَلَكِنْ تَرْكُهَا الْأَوْلَى. Although he mentions those things that are disliked, he says that al-hasir generally means a straw mat. He says that a straw mat is not discouraged, but is khilaf al-awla. Khilaf al-awla means, although it's a bit less than makruh. It's a bit less than those things that are makruh, meaning discouraged, meaning that they're those actions that, it's contrary to what's preferable. So it's a little less than makruh. The ulama didn't give it the ruling of makruh, but we have something called khilaf al-awla, which means doing something contrary to what's preferable. So praying on a straw mat, because praying on a straw mat doesn't provide that comfort and luxury like a carpet does, because the prayer mat is soft, and so on and so forth, and the mat is like straw, and so it's similar to the ground, but it's still not the ground. So for that reason, they said it's contrary to what is preferable, and that's what he means by بِخِلَافِ الْحَسِيرِ, contrary to a straw mat. فَإِنَّهُ لَا يُكْرَهُ, it is not, verily it is not disliked, as-sujud alayha, making sujood on it, walakin, but tarkuha awla, but leaving it behind, meaning not to use it, is considered awla, preferable. Then he moves on to the next one by saying was-sujud ala al-ardi afdalu, yani was-sujud ala al-ardi afdalu, yani and know that making sujood on the ground is preferable. In other words, he means mustahab. وَمِنَ الْمَكْرُوهِ السُّجُودُ عَلَى كَوْرِ إِمَامَتِهِ, and he says from the things that are considered makruh are making sajda on one's sleeve. Yani making sajda on one's sleeve is hard for people to understand. Kawrihi means his turban. Yani was sujud ala kawri imamatihi, meaning if a person is wearing a turban, it is disliked to make sujood on it. And similar to a turban would be when you're wearing a kufi. What they're referring to here is the fact that one makes sujood with the forehead covered. So as long as if the forehead is covered, then it is considered makruh. And what they usually mention is 2 wraps. If one were to have 2 wraps or less, then that would be makruh. But if one were to make sujood, for example, on a turban that had 6 or 7 or 8 wraps, then technically speaking, they wouldn't be making sujood, and that would not be sufficient. So it is disliked to have the forehead covered with a piece of cloth or a kufi or 1 or 2 wraps of a turban, and that's what he's referring to as sujud ala kawri imamatihi. And then he mentions أو طرف كمه أو ردائه. Likewise, it would be disliked for a person to make sujood on his sleeve. What he's referring to here is sometimes, just like the suit, if anybody's ever seen a Sudani thobe, the sleeves are a bit wide. So technically speaking, if a person was to make sujood, as long as his 2 hands are right beside his head, it is conceivable or possible that he could make sujood on the sleeve, because his sleeves are wide and his forehead is in between his 2 hands, and so making sujood on his sleeve is considered disliked. Or his you can say his shoulder wrap or his cape. Al-rida is like a long sheet that you throw over your shoulders when you're praying, and it drapes down like a cape, which is recommended in the Malikiyas to wear during their prayer. But making sajda on it, so that you're placing your head and your hands on it, is considered disliked. So your hands should touch the ground and your forehead should touch the ground, without the rida being between the ground and the forehead, and the arms likewise, in the hands likewise. وَالْقِرَاءَةُ فِي الرُّكُوعِ وَالسُّجُودِ, reading Quran in ruku' wa sujud, because the Prophet ﷺ said, نُحِيتُ أَنْ أَقْرَأُ الْقُرْآنُ رَاكِعًا أَوْ سَاجِدًا, I have been prohibited from reading the Quran during ruku' and sujud. So ruku' and sujud is not the place where qira'ah of the Quran is read, but qiyams, the standing, is the place where the Quran is read, and so that is disliked. So that's what he means when he says وَالْقِرَاءَةُ فِي الرُّكُوعِ وَالسُّجُودِ وَالدُّعَاءُ بِالْأَعْجَمِيَّةِ لِقَادِرٍ عَلَى الْعَرَبِيَّةِ. This one that he's mentioned here is something that's not specific to the prayer, it's general. But because dua is generally related to the prayer, he mentions it here. The issue that he mentions is making dua in a foreign language. For anybody who has the ability to speak Arabic, it's considered disliked. That's what he means by وَالدُّعَاءُ بِالْأَعْجَمِيَّةِ لِقَادِرٍ عَلَى الْعَرَبِيَّةِ. Yani for a person who has the ability to speak Arabic, it is disliked for him to supplicate to Allah in another language such as English or French. And the reason why it says لِقَادِرٍ عَلَى الْعَرَبِيَّةِ is because if a person didn't have the ability to speak Arabic or express himself in Arabic, then it's not disliked for him to make dua in to make dua in another language. But that is outside of prayer. Understand that inside of prayer, it is not permissible for a person to speak any language other than the Arabic language. If they were to read a dua during their tashahhud, then their prayers would be invalid, because there is no using a foreign language during the prayer according to the Maliki school. Then he mentions wal-iltifatu fi salati. Al-iltifatu fi salati means to look around in prayer. Simply to look around in prayer is considered disliked, although they mention that if a person were to look around out of forgetfulness, then it would be forgiven. But looking around in prayer is considered disliked. That's what he means by wal-iltifatu fi salati. So if a person is going to look towards the ground, then they should look to the ground. And if they're going to look straight ahead, which is a position in the Maliki school, to look straight ahead, then a person can look straight ahead. But if they choose to look straight ahead, then they shouldn't start looking down. And if they choose to look down, then they shouldn't choose to then during the prayer look ahead. And even more so than that, they shouldn't choose to look left and look right while they're in their prayer, because this negates khushu', humbleness in the prayer. وَتَشْبِيكُ أَصَابِعِهِ. Tashbiku asabi'ihi means to hold his hands together in the prayer by weaving his fingers together. That's considered dislike in prayer. And he mentions وَفَرَكَعَتُهَا, cracking the fingers. Cracking the fingers, which is a bad habit, or cracking the knuckles, which you see many people doing in the prayer today. That is considered disliked, because all of that, just like what we mentioned before in terms of looking around in prayer, negates khushu' in prayer. And they say وَوَضْعُ يَدَيْهِ عَلَى خَاسِرَتِهِ, placing one's hands on the waist when they're praying, placing them on their hip. And they say that this is one of the the reason why it's disliked because this is the way that the Jewish pray. I have not seen it. I have not seen the Jewish people praying, but this is what is always mentioned in the books of Fiqh, that it is considered disliked because it is how the Jewish pray. وَإِقْعَاؤُهُ means is referring to a specific sitting position between the two sajdas. For example, you'll see some people when they sit in the prayer, they will sit, when they come up from the sitting position, they keep their toes upwards and they sit on the back of their heels. Sitting on the back of your heels in prayer is considered disliked. For example, when a person comes up from sujood, they put their toes standing up, and then when they're sitting back, their buttocks is sitting on the back of the heel of the feet. This is considered disliked. It is also disliked to take the top of the feet and lay them outward, and so that you're sitting back on the bottom of your feet. All of these things are what we consider ik'a. So these type of sitting positions are considered disliked. Either a person stands his feet up by putting his toes up, so that when he sits back between the two sajdas, or when he's doing his tashahhud, his buttocks is on the heel of the feet. Or another form of ik'a is when the top of the feet are face down on the ground, and the person's buttock is sitting on the bottom parts of the feet. Then he goes on to mention وَتَغْمِيدُ عَيْنَيْهِ, closing one's eyes during the prayer, as if it necessitates that one is getting close to their Lord. This is also considered disliked because there is no instruction in the Sharia or nothing that necessitates that closing one's eyes makes one get closer to Allah. And so that was considered disliked. So that is considered disliked in prayer. Then he mentions وَوَضْعُ قَدَمِهِ عَلَى الْأُخْرَى, placing one foot on the other. Sometimes people do this when they're lazy. They'll take one foot and put it on the other. I've never seen it done in a prayer before, but sometimes people do it. placing one foot on top of the other in prayer. Sometimes when they're too lazy to stand up for qiyam, then they'll put one foot on top of the other and then switch back and forth. وَتَفَكُّرُهُ بِأَمْرٍ دُنْيَوِيٍّ, and thinking about matters that are related to worldly affairs. These things, doing such is considered disliked. These things are considered disliked because, once again, they negate khushu' in prayer and occupy one with the matters that one should not be occupied with, because during the prayer one should be focused on their Lord, and so focusing on the dunya negates the fact that one is supposed to be focusing on his Lord. Then he goes on to mention وَحَمْلُ شَيْءٍ بِكُمِّهِ أَوْ فَمِهِ وَعَبَثٌ بِلِحْيَتِهِ, or carrying anything in his sleeves or in his mouth that is distracting. Yani, in the past, the people used to tie their sheets of paper to their wrist in order to carry them. Maybe they would just they would take the paper and wrap it around the bottom of their arm and put a rope on it. And so that's what he means by kummihi, holding things in your sleeves that will distract you when you're praying, so that when you're moving your hands up and down, then you'll hear sounds or will cause some type of distraction, or holding something in your mouth. They mentioned in the books of fiqh that sometimes the people used to hold some of their money in their mouth. Today, technically speaking, nobody does that, but we can give another example of a person praying with a toothpick in his mouth or a miswak in his mouth is considered disliked because it's distracting, and it stops one from properly reciting the Quran or any type of thing that he has to read in prayer. And so he mentions waham, that's what he means by wahamlu shay'in bi kummihi aw famihi, yani holding something in his sleeve or holding something in his mouth. Wa abathun bi lihyatihi, and also playing with his beard in prayer. Some people have this habit to twist their beard when they're praying. This is considered disliked because, again, it negates khushu'. Now the issue that he's going to mention is the issue of reading Bismillah wa a'udhu billah in the prayer. And he says wal mashhur, meaning the famous opinion, the sound opinion according to the Malikiyah concerning fil basmalati wa ta'awudhi, meaning saying Bismillah at the beginning of the prayer after the takbir, and a'udhu billahi minash shaitan, is makruh fil farida duna nafila. It's considered disliked it is considered disliked to read these two in the fard prayer. So in the fard prayer, as soon as you say your takbir, you go right ahead and you start reading your Surah al-Fatiha without saying A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajeem and without saying Bismillah. But it is permissible in nafila, are perfectly fine in nafila. وعن مالك قول بالإباحة, and although that is the mashhur opinion, there is an opinion from Imam Malik that says even in Farida it's considered permissible. Then he goes on to clarify وعن ابن مسلمة أنها مندوبة. He's going to mention that some of the companions of Imam Malik held a contrary opinion on this matter, and he says وعن Ibn Maslamata, a companion of Imam Malik, أنها مندوبة. He was of the opinion that it was mandub, meaning that it was mustahab, it was recommended or encouraged. وعن ابن نافع وجوبها, and from the companion Ibn Nafi', he was of the opinion that it was obligatory to read the basmala. So closing up the section, the author says فَإِنْ فَعَلَ شَيْءٍ مِنَ الْمَكْرُهَاتِ فِي صَلَاتِهِ كُرِهَ لَهُ ذَلِكَ وَلَا تَبْطُلُ صَلَاتُهُ وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ. So he says, and if a person were to do any one of these things that are disliked, فَعَلَ شَيْءٍ مِنَ الْمَكْرُهَاتِ فِي صَلَاتِهِ كُرِهَ لَهُ ذَلِكَ, it is disliked for him to do so. وَلَكِنْ, it does not nullify his prayer. And that's what he means when he says وَلَا تَبْطُلُ صَلَاتُهُ, meaning in his prayer is not invalid by doing a disliked act, although some of the thawab is decrease from his prayer. And then he says, Wallahu a'lam. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.